Okay, so that was Mr. Dean actually singing to Percy Grainger. And this is such a great resource, these recordings, these field recordings, which we happen to own because they're in the Library of Congress, the original wax cylinders. And so this is this wonderful resource from the United States Navy Band that have put this. It's all available online. So these are the actual folk singers singing these songs, Lisbon, to Percy Grainger. And in the score, and this has always been the case, even in the original score, there is this lengthy program note from Grainger, which takes almost as much time to read as it does to perform the piece, but it's chock full of interesting information, a description of the singers, and it's amazing to me how many people have never read it, even though they performed Lincolnshire Posy. So it's like undue withoutable to actually read the program notes. And then what I get from listening to Mr. Dean, you're not going to try, I don't think, in any way to emulate his style. But what Grainger says is he was trying to imbue some of the personality of these singers into the music. And when he recorded this, Mr. Dean had a gash in his head from having fallen down the stairs. And this is this lively man, even though he's in his 60s, lively spirit, who loves these songs and wants to sing them, and was sort of protesting a little bit, saying he was maybe a little bit too tired. And Grainger said to him, well, you know, I have these recordings of other singers singing, so maybe I'll just use them. And of course then he, no, I can sing for you. And then he went on to sing the song. So it, in some ways, it tells you about the spirit of this person. And I think that's what I try to focus on, rather than the actual specific tempo that he's singing. Like all Grainger pieces, the way he translates it, puts it into Lincolnshire Posy, it is strophic variations. And so each strophe is treated a little bit differently, but they have a sparkle to them. And I think that's what he's getting at with trying to emulate the personality of Mr. Dean. For instance, at 18, this bubbly, effervescent woodwind treatment with the double bass and the timpani underneath that, it seems that it makes it, in a way, very cheerful. I think there's a wide dynamic range in Mr. Dean's personality, but also in the way he sings the song. And so I think that has to come into the music as well. So it's fascinating the way Grainger set all of these songs, not in a strict literal way that they were sung to him, but again, taking the personality of the singer and focusing on that. To me, this is the most fascinating of all of the movements. And again, I think the way it is sung is so beautiful. I think what Grainger tries to do is there's clear text painting that goes on here. And so that's what leads to this big clash at the end, because that's the moment when Steel Eye is struck and goes to the ground. Again, the personality of the singer, it's a beautiful voice, even though this is all these years later, over 100 years later, on a wax cylinder. This untrained musician that Grainger had the greatest affection for, folk singers. He thought that, they were too often neglected and looked down upon. So there's something about this, the whole way Grainger treats it, because the title, of course, is Harkstone Grange, The Miser and His Man, a Local Tragedy. And I think the tragedy of this is what Grainger is using, especially from the way that Mr. Goldthorpe sings it. I think, again, it doesn't relate to the tempo. We're not trying to emulate the tempo of the folk singer, but there's something about the quality of his voice, the beauty of his voice, and then the inflection at the end when it's at its climactic moment that sort of tells you everything you need to know about how the piece goes, even though it's not about the tempo. I think the character of the singer, and this is not about necessarily the quality of the voice, although there is something to that, is very beautiful. Especially how it begins. And, the story begins harmlessly enough and then builds, to this rather violent conclusion. But it says right at the beginning that they fell out one day. So I think there's something about this juxtaposition of the beauty of his voice and the phrasing, which is really gorgeous. And you can hear it in his voice when it gets to the big climactic moment, even though he doesn't stretch the tempo, but there's more passion in that lets you know that this is a big moment, and it's the reason for that huge clash that Grainger so brilliantly orchestrates. I think this is, to me, it's my favorite movement, although I would be hard-pressed to say that because Rupert Park Poachers is my second favorite or equally favorite, but then Lord Melbourne is really good too. So I could keep going with all of this, but again, it's hard to say which is my favorite movement, but I do love this one. And I love the way that Mr. Taylor sings it. And, there's this controversy, except it's not really a controversy, about what the tempo of this movement should be. And he sings it at around eighth note equals 132. As everyone knows who's done the piece, it says quarter note equals 132. The original published score, and then for years in this edition, the Fennell edition, it was listed as 132. And the reason for that is because Mr. Fennell, Dr. Fennell, sent a recording to Percy Grainger before they made the Mercury recording, but it was of a concert performance. And he had questions about the tempo of this movement. And so he sent it to him, and Grainger said, "That's exactly right. That's it." And it was at quarter equals 132. And many years later, when he was able to see the score at the Grainger Museum in Melbourne, Australia, he and I both saw that it was eighth note equals 132. So he was going to change it in the next edition, and unfortunately that didn't happen at that time, and it took years until that happened. But we can hear on this recording that it is eighth note equals 132. There's also this famous recording of Grainger playing and singing it at the harmonium that is exactly eighth note equals 132. And then it makes sense, because when it's eighth note equals 132, at the next tempo change, where it says somewhat faster, quarter note about 80, that tells you it has to be slower at the beginning. I love this recording because, first of all, again, Mr. Taylor has a beautiful voice, but it's like all of the inflection, that's how it's metered by Grainger. So in this case, I think he was pretty specific with this recording, and it wasn't just putting it all into 2 or into 3 or 4, but this is the reason for the use of 5/8, 4/8, alternating back to 5/8. The other thing that's worth considering is whether to use the soprano saxophone or a cornet, flugelhorn, trumpet, because there are these two versions, version A and version B. This time, I've made the decision to use version A, but use the saxophone in version A rather than the cornet or flugelhorn, just because in a way it's different, and because I think there's something about the soprano saxophone that relates to Mr. Taylor's voice, and I think there's a color about that. From a stylistic standpoint, all of these great crescendi, diminuendi that Grainger writes, I think he's reflecting the way Mr. Taylor did sing. Maybe not exactly, because it's a solo line, and of course Grainger embellishes that by making it this kind of macabre canon, and I think that's part of the mystery of it also. So I think it's a fantastic treatment. So, Mrs. Thompson, the singer of that one, is fantastic. Bless her heart, right? As we say here in Texas. The variations that Grainger has, it has a lot of spark to it. And I think her personality has a lot, her tempo doesn't, but her personality has a lot of spark. And then she just goes for it. And I think that is what Grainger was trying to get, especially in this, it makes sense in this little woodwind obligato, that famous lick. I think it's just about being this sprightly singer, with full of personality. So I think the way that Grainger took each variation and added an overlay a little bit more. There's some text painting in this one, but not really as much as in the other movements. But nonetheless, I think that this one he captures the personality of the singer beautifully. So that one I really like. George Ray, Mr. George Ray was the singer of that. This one tells you, obviously the free time is pretty evident, but what he is singing here is put into the middle section. So again, it reflects what the meter is, really almost perfectly. But I think that Grainger had a thing, I don't know if this is true or not, about conductors. And he got tired of conductors messing up his music. And so he's written all of the rubato really into the meters. I think that's the reason for the metric choices there. And for the reason that he says 3/8 versus 1.5, 4. I think he's telling the conductor how to conduct it. When it's in 3/8, you conduct it in 3, and when it's 1.5, 4, you conduct it in 1 to the bar. At least that's what I believe. But as far as this recording this performance, there's a lot of background noise in it. And the reason for that is because the wax cylinders were in terrible shape when these were extracted. So what you're hearing is a sh 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 sh, because they're almost completely dilapidated. So I'm glad that these recordings were made when they were recorded, so that we could actually hear this. But as far as Mr. Ray goes, I think the way he articulates the text tells you how noble this movement should be. Again, it doesn't have anything to do with the tempo so much, but it does have everything to do with the style and the fact that he was a very bold singer. It's very interesting, because that is The Lost Lady Found. However, it's not the tune that Grainger uses. We Americans, as we listen to this, oh yeah, I know that. That's Sweet Betsy from Pike, except it's the wrong text. It's another version of The Lost Lady Found. Mrs. Hill, who was the name of the singer, so it's a different person who sings actually on this. But this is the same text, it's just a different tune. But I think there are a couple of things about it. One is this famous in the middle of it, bar 50, where the piccolo comes in, almost like someone out in the pasture whistling, that sort of smooth thing with the saxophones moving very quietly underneath. And from that moment, the piece begins to build and build and build toward the ending. So it does have this very large ending at the place that becomes so famous for everyone who has ever put the piece together, where the woodwinds always rush and the brass always drag, the spot. I think it's a marvelous piece, and it's a great ending. I've heard people complain about the last movement before, thinking that, well, that shouldn't really end the suite. I think it's the perfect ending to the suite. And in my opinion, because it is a folk song suite, I think not taking much time between all the movements for me is a really good idea, in a way almost the way that this recording was put together by the Navy Band. After all these years, 1937, it's still a masterpiece.